Hi and welcome to my OCR A-Level Biology revision session with me, Christine. So today's lesson, I want to look at your Module 6, Populations and Sustainability topic, and specifically looking at your timber production and fishing. So you should know that when we look at sustainability and we talk about small-scale timber production, we want to talk about a process called coppicing. So what we have are a way in which we can take some trees, we can cut the tree trunk down so that it's really close to the ground, and what will then happen is several new shoots will form from the cut surface and they will then mature. Now these are then cut and used to make different timber products such as fencing. So it's important to note that this takes us back to the fact that plants have meristem cells that have the capacity to divide by mitosis and differentiate. So when we do the process of coppicing, this cutting the tree trunk down close to that ground, what that then means is that we can then grow more shoots to use in a sustainable way. Well, what we have to be aware of though is if we're going to do this, we have to think about the knock-on effect that it has to the environment. So if we are removing these tree trunks and therefore removing these trees which could be habitats for different organisms, we should do what's known as a rotational coppicing process. Now, by doing this rotational coppicing process, it means that we are going to be able to maintain biodiversity. Now, that is normally because by doing this rotation process, the trees never grow enough to block out that light. So this takes us back to the point where we talk about succession and reaching that climax community. So if we're not allowing the natural process of succession to occur, we are therefore deflecting that succession. We actually increase the biodiversity by doing this process. We cut the trees down because we need them so that we can build different materials to sustain the growing human population, but we're also doing it in a way that maintains the biodiversity. So by doing this rotational coppicing, we only cut down those which would therefore have gone on to create a climax community, which would have lowered the biodiversity. So that's important to think about. The other thing we need to consider is the fact that when we cut the tree trunk down close to the ground, we're not removing the plants completely. We're not removing these trees, therefore their roots are still anchored into the ground. And that's important because those roots being present in the soil actually anchors the soil and therefore prevents soil erosion. If we were to uproot the whole tree to use for the timber production, that would therefore result in potential mudslides, potential soil erosion, and therefore affect the biodiversity. So it's really important that we link that we need this sustainable production of timber, but also considering its effect on the environment and the biodiversity. Now, obviously, we also need to think about large-scale timber production. So coppicing is that small-scale timber production, but we do also need to do large-scale timber production, and we do that through a process called clear felling. Now, this is where all the trees in an area are cut down. So if you live, for example, in the UK and you live near where I am, I'm in Cambridge, I will therefore drive potentially to Thetford Forest, and on the way to Thetford Forest I can always see areas where there has been this clear felling occurred. You can see the trees have been cut down, you can see them sitting waiting to be transported to then be turned into whatever products they're going to become. So to make this sustainable, because that's what we're talking about, managing ecosystems in a sustainable way, to make it sustainable, these timber companies have to do some of the following. They need to practice what's known as selective cutting, only cutting down the largest trees, leaving those that are immature. Now remember, natural flow of succession, We have different levels of biodiversity. If we have an immature plant, that is therefore going to allow enough light through for the plants underneath. We only want to be cutting down those which have already got to that largest point where we're reaching that climax community. So practicing this selective cutting is one way. Another way is where we replace the trees that have been cut down through replanting. Now, by replanting, we are therefore putting organisms back, which could be the habitats, it could be the food source. So therefore, by replacing through that replanting, we are trying to manage this ecosystem in a sustainable way. With the growing population, the human population, we need these resources. So we have to find ways that balances between the needs of the humans, but also the needs of the ecosystem. We can reduce competition between the trees by ensuring that there's a minimum distance between those replanted trees. So by replanting the trees that we have cut down, we will therefore allow them to grow. And if we were to place them too close together, they would then start to compete for resources. So reduce the competition by ensuring there's a minimum distance between those replanted trees. Also, limiting the size of the area that can be felled. Remember, I said before about the fact that the roots are going to anchor in the soil and therefore reduce soil erosion. If we are felling a large area, that is going to have an effect on that soil and therefore have an effect on the ability for that to be eroded. So it's important that we limit the size of the area being felled. And also, just like before when we talked about the small scale timber production, rotation is important. We want to allow the trees that we have replanted to actually grow to maturation before we want to cut them down. So it's important that we are doing a rotation of the felling to ensure that we are not affecting too many species in one area, which could cause destruction. Now, the other part of the sustainable food sources that you need to understand is to do with fishing. Now, fish are really good sources of protein and they are a renewable energy source. So therefore, you have to understand that we can go and fish, we can then bring the fish back, we can cook it, we can get really high protein sources in our diet. Well, if we go past what's known as the maximum sustainable yield, what we could do is we could cause the population of fish to crash. So therefore, the maximum sustainable yield is the largest amount of a fish population that can be harvested without a decline in stocks. So although fishermen can go out and try to fish and bring in their fishing quotas, what you have to be aware of is if they take too many out of the population, there's not going to be enough for reproduction to produce more to sustain the population. So what will happen is if we overfish, we will result in a population crash. So we need to ensure that any fishing that is done in a sustainable way. And therefore, to do it in a sustainable way, there are certain restrictions that have to be put on fishing. So things like the international agreements on fishing quotas. There is a limit on catching certain species and how many of them they can catch. So when the fishermen come in, they will weigh their fish that they have caught, and then if they have caught too many, what that will do is they will end up with getting a fine because they have gone above this agreement of fishing quotas. Now this becomes a bit of a problem because some fishermen, if they know that they are going to go over their quotas, can actually catch the fish and then just throw that extra part back into the sea, and therefore that limits their fine that they could get. Well, what they've actually done is they could have hurt and damaged the fish, and that could then have a knock-on effect on the ability for them to reproduce and produce more. So it's really important that this is actually monitored in a specific way so that there is no way in which we can have an effect on the environment that would cause the fish to crash. Now, the other thing we can do with sustainable fishing is using nets. So if we use nets with different mesh sizes, that will ensure that any immature fish can escape. Why is that important? Well, immature fish will not have reached maturation for reproductive levels. So therefore, we want to allow the fish that are not yet at that reproductive age to still be out in the environment so that they can reproduce, producing more offspring. We can also have that we protect the breeding seasons by limiting when people can actually do the fishing. So for example, we only allow the fishing to occur between May and July. Any other periods, it is not actually allowed. And also we can have what's known as fish farming, where we actually do it in a sustainable way, where we are growing the fish in a very secure area. So that's linking to our conservation and thinking about this fish farming, where we are not allowing them to have a natural habitat. They are still within their area, but we are actually controlling that and we are farming them. So we are checking their health, we're checking their sizes, and only those that reach the age and are at the right level are therefore removed, and we are maintaining that level so that we do not have a population crash. So I hope you've liked this video, and if you have, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't already done so, please do check my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com.